I know we're not supposed to mention the International Monetary Fund without a joke, but I think in the interests of public decency, I'll focus on its most recent forecast rather than its chief executive's most recent peccadillos. The growth forecast for this year has been revised downwards by the IMF. I think it's now below 2%. And by international standards, this can't be regarded as soaring economic acceleration. Worse still, our neighbors in Europe seem intent on a kind of self-destructive crisis, which is bound to have ramifications for us, whether we like it or not. And having just returned from Germany, I can assure you that there is almost no sign that the German political elite grasps the extent to which its policies are plunging peripheral Europe into a depression and not merely a recession. When other economies in the world are growing at rates of between 5 and 10%, we can't really afford, I think, to be complacent. Where I agree, for example, with Lord Griffiths, is that the remedy for this relatively low growth is not to be sought in hyper-Keynesian fiscal stimulus, or for that matter, in the kind of state monopoly capitalism currently fashionable in the People's Republic of China and its imitators. Market Leninism cannot be our savior. I think we have to recognize why growth is going to be relatively low in the short term. The excessive household leverage that accumulated in the UK over the last decade or so is not going to disappear overnight. And in international terms, there really is nobody that can quite match the British when it comes to household balance sheet leverage. Nor is Eastern competition about to disappear. For those who are unskilled, and I'm afraid all too many people in this country are unskilled, the prospect must be of declining living standards. There's simply no place for them to hide. We also have a skew towards the financial sector in this country's economy that is not likely to pay rich dividends, however we regulate or don't regulate our bankers. The age of finance has in many ways passed. And one of the most striking things about a trip to Germany of the sort that I've just made is that the most bullish people you encounter there are the industrialists. Finally, we have to bear in mind that this country is emerging from a period in which the public sector was allowed to inflate in size somewhat disastrously. And one thing that is going to take an awful long time to sort out is that bloating of the least productive sector of the economy. So that's the reason why the growth that does come is not going to come easy. What exactly can a government do about this? Well, here I want to echo a point that was made well by Lord Griffiths. We have acted preemptively in dealing with the massive fiscal crisis that this country faced. And all credit, I think, should go to George Osborne for taking some extraordinarily difficult political steps and to tread where most other European governments did not dare to go. The result is that Britain has avoided the kind of crisis that I think would have swept aside a weaker government if, in a nightmare parallel universe, Gordon Brown had somehow remained in office. So, fiscal stabilization is an extraordinarily important first step. And whenever you hear anybody criticize the very painful steps that will be taken this year in particular, remind them of how much worse things could be if we had played Russian roulette with the bond market. You don't need to be in the Eurozone to experience an extremely unpleasant sensation if your bond yields begin to rise before your austerity program has even begun. The other crucial thing to bear in mind is that we have and must retain freedom of action in the realm of monetary policy. If you want to ask another counterfactual question, even more terrifying than the question of where we would be if Gordon Brown were still Prime Minister, ask yourself where we would be if Tony Blair had prevailed over Mr. Brown and this country had become a member of the European Monetary Union. It doesn't bear thinking about because it would really be on a scale Imagine, I suppose, Ireland to the power of 10, and you have some sense of where we might find ourselves today. So long as we retain that monetary flexibility, we have options that others are now denied on the continent. If you read the work of economic thinkers like Hernando de Soto, or for that matter, Adam Smith, the founder of modern economics, the rest that government should do is remarkably simple. Ensure that there is competition, ensure that there is transparency, ensure that there is no corruption in the public sphere, minimize red tape, achieve fiscal neutrality and a level playing field, and then let Luke Johnson get on with it. Let's look at two specific things that might make Luke's life easier and therefore the number of people employed by him and his counterparts larger. I do think that it's sad that this country only has Luke Johnson to sing the praises of the entrepreneur. In the United States, the Kaufman Foundation has been for some years now generating extraordinarily good research to show how it is entrepreneurs, startups, and small businesses that not only create the jobs, but are in fact the dynamo of the US economy. We need to give Luke some support here, because at times he seems to be a one-man band on this question. We also need, I think, to revisit old questions which have yet to be answered about the many poverty traps that exist in our fiscal system and in our welfare system. There really is an extraordinary mess in the realm, for example, of the way in which people qualify for invalidity benefit. The government has begun some very difficult work, and it has begun, I think, rightly in the sphere of fiscal stabilization and retrenchment. But the next step, and it must be taken soon in my view, is to look much, much harder at the structural obstacles, both to entrepreneurship and to employment, that exist in this country. You don't just need entrepreneurs, you need willing workers. And the number of obstacles to the willing worker in this country really sometimes depresses me. I am, of course, not an entrepreneur. I'm a much less useful and much more parasitical thing, a professor. So I think it's appropriate that I should say a few words about education. There is a problem in the British education system. Really only a very few institutions in the UK educational system work, and they're nearly all private institutions in the secondary school sector. Most of the rest is in some way or another profoundly broken. We need to look at best practice, for example, in the sphere of technical education for the non-academically inclined pupil. Rather than giving everybody a standardized humanities degree in soft subjects, let us look again at what the Germans do so right when it comes to educating their technically able, not academically inclined teenagers. One of the keys to Germany's success is not just the businessmen who run the Mittelstand, it's the men who work for them, and indeed women who work for them, that make those companies so successful. They are more skilled than their British counterparts by a very significant margin indeed, as international studies have been showing for years, and yet we still do nothing about it. Then I turn to the universities. In the United States, universities like Harvard and Stanford are engines of economic growth and innovation. They are not merely educational institutions. They are extraordinarily important clusters of innovation. It cannot be said that British universities come close, though it must be said that some have made strides in the right direction. We need to recognize the importance of universities as something other than degree factories for the middle classes. Much, much more can be done, and the most important thing of all, in my view, is to increase the amount of private funding that there is in the tertiary sector. There are too few private universities in this country, and it's the private universities more than the public universities in the United States that make the running. That is something we could address. It would not be difficult to encourage benefaction in that area. Finally, let's not forget that the gap between our teenagers and Asia's teenagers is widening in a really dramatic fashion, particularly when it comes to attainment in mathematics and science. Look at the surveys, the international standardized tests for 14-year-olds, and you will be dumbstruck by the gap that now exists between East Asians and people in Western Europe, particularly, I'm afraid to say, people in my own country, Scotland. Once a country which had high standards of mathematical education, and now a country which really languishes in the league tables. I'm a historian as well as an academic. Let me tell you what causes growth, since we're all here to talk about that subject. Growth is about total factor productivity. It is not about increasing the quantity of inputs, it is about the quality. And the most important way in which total factor productivity is increased historically is through improvements in human capital, that is to say in nutrition and the education of human beings, and technology. Increments in technology, in the efficiency of technology, are often boosted by the network effects that you get, not only in cities, but in the kind of clusters that I was talking about earlier in the case of universities. And then don't forget openness. One of the points I try to make in my book, Civilisation, which is my most recent publication on this subject, is that it was the openness of Western economies to trade, to capital flows, to migration of skilled workers that provided them with a key wholly absent in the great Oriental empires. So, let's draw these threads together and make some conclusions. I don't think growth is likely to be high in this country in the short term. It will become a political problem for the coalition before too long. But in my view, the coalition is and will remain for some years well weighed down by the mistakes of the past for which this government is not responsible. But growth could rise despite the burdens of public and private debt that David Cameron inherited if we press on with a radical reform of public finance, do not lose our nerve in this area, if we maintain our monetary sovereignty and use it judiciously, and if we drive far more aggressively than we have in previous decades up our educational standards at the secondary and tertiary level in particular. Thank you very much.